If everyone could start to sit down, we'll probably get started pretty soon. We understand there's some traffic stuff, so we're just dragging our feet a little bit. Everyone coming in late says they hit traffic, so probably start in like 5 minutes.
Your choice. Then you can see.
All right, hello, we're going to get started. My name is Mitch Thompson. I am Vice President of Humanists of Minnesota, and I want to welcome you to our November community gathering. It's great to see everyone, and we have some people online as well, I understand. So a special welcome to any new visitors today. We sincerely appreciate your attendance. A couple of quick announcements. If you're not familiar with the layout here, the bathrooms, if you go out the hall and to the left and all the way, almost to the end of the hallway, you'll find a couple of bathrooms. You can also go down the stairs, and at the bottom of the stairs, also take a left. There are also bathrooms down there. Starting around 4:30, we're going to have a social hour, and please do stay to socialize, meet new people, and get better acquainted with or catch up with friends. We try to keep our refreshments self-sustaining, so please consider a contribution with a donation to help cover our costs. Next month, we are not going to be at FUS, and we're not going to have a speaker, but we're going to do more of a party, for lack of a better word, at Stray Dog in southeast Minneapolis, and that's Postal Southeast. That will be from 4 to 7, and on a slightly different date. Also, it's close to the new year, so December 30th. The size of the room that we have is somewhat limited to about 40 people, so we are asking you to RSVP, if possible, to help us kind of navigate how we're going to handle that. And we hope that we get 40 people and that we have that problem. So please sign up as soon as possible if you plan on going to next month's community gathering. One of the things that we like to do before we start the meetings is talk a little bit about what Humanists MN is about. We're a secular community for ethical living. We are committed to the well-being of all and the sustainability of the planet, embracing the concept of human flourishing. One of my problems when I talk a lot in front of people is I talk too fast. So I'm going to try to slow down. So if I sound like a robot, it's because I'm trying to slow down here. We seek to champion secular, moral, civic, and political leadership and normalize non-belief. We are a home for those seeking a community of naturally curious, compassionate, and rational people who gather for friendship, personal growth, doing good together, and normalizing the non-religious naturalist worldview. And the non-religious worldview is still fairly uncommon, I think a lot of us find. And so this is a place that we want to have, to be a comfortable place to come and explore that. We are an all-volunteer organization. We depend on the goodwill, service, and generosity of our members and friends to further our mission, and to use an often found phrase in the religious community, spread the word. We are also a very active organization. We primarily organize through Meetup, and if you check in with Meetup, you'll find things like the Think Book Club, Humanists in Action, which have a number of events that they take on every month. We have several different types of happy hours, some of them kind of focusing on St. Paul, focusing on Minneapolis, some of them online. Audrey Kingstrom does the Tenets of Humanism, which is an introduction to humanism, which I'm pretty sure that's how I got involved in all this. There's a secular grief group, which is led by, or sort of facilitated by, one of our board members, Seth. And we have several other book clubs as well. We also have several groups beginning to organize sort of in the metro areas, kind of having their own events, and it's not really a splintering, it's like a way for the people to maybe more geographically easily have other events going on. So that's starting to develop, as well as some outstate stuff that we're trying to facilitate more of. We have a lot of volunteering opportunities. You know, we're all volunteer-driven organization. We have a lot of groups that deal with running the organization, you know, things like marketing and financial related things, and not all of those are board members. We have people from the organization involved in that. And one thing I want to clarify, something came up just recently about Meetup, and people thinking that they're a member of the Humanists of Minnesota if they join Meetup. And that is not the case. It is certainly a way that we organize, but to be a member of the Humanists, you have to be a dues-paying member, which is a fairly small amount of $40 for a year, or $60 for a household, $40 for an individual, $60 for a household. Those dues basically go to covering, you know, like renting this room and paying a very small amount of money for our speakers today, and other things, the food that you'll see at this event, and helping organize the other events that we have. We've done some stuff with working on scholarship matching and scholarships. Camp Quest is something that we put money towards. So those dues really do go to work. And of course, we also accept donations. We just recently got a donation of $1,000, which again helps us spread the word and have a lot of capacity when opportunities strike to market the organization. We've been getting deeper into technology, which is a very new thing, but also very important now for any organization to be able to reach out to people online. If you want to find out more about us, of course, we have a very active website, humanistmn.org. You can sign up to our newsletter there, find out who's on the board, find out just about anything about our organization. It's very much the heart of our operation. And it also will link into the, help you get to the meetup to follow, to sign up or RSVP or know about the other events going on. We also encourage you to follow us on social media. We are trying to be very active in Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, which I don't know if has anybody heard of Twitter? Is it it's this new thing. I think that's about it. But the social media is great because it does really help us spread the word. So if you're involved in it and you can retweet or put stuff on Facebook or Instagram, that would be awesome. Okay, so my public speaking duties are done, which I love public speaking. I'm going to introduce Suzanne Perry, who is now going to introduce our speakers for today's event. And thank you.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Suzanne Perry. I'm on the board of Humanists MN. I'm also on the program committee. And I want to ask, is everybody glad the election is over? I would say yes, too, although I'm feeling a little lonely these days because I'm not getting my daily texts from my good friends like John Fetterman and Beto O'Rourke and Tim Walz. But here we are. I can talk about the election with my friends in real life and our two political experts here. First up will be Christopher Chapp, who's an associate professor of political science and the Morrison Family Director of the Institute for Freedom and Community at St. Olaf College. Chris is an expert in political campaigns, and he has some research interests that will probably resonate with this audience. One is the impact of religion in U.S. politics. He's written a book about that topic. He's also revising a book now about the role of moral issues like abortion and LGBTQ rights in American public opinion. After Chris dissects the results of the congressional races, Torey Van Oot will discuss the outcome of Minnesota state and legislative contests. Torey is a reporter who covered the midterm elections for Axios Twin Cities. In case you're not familiar with Axios, it's a national news operation that in the past couple of years has started newsletters that serve particular cities, including the Twin Cities. And it covers politics, business, and culture, all in a very digestible form. Torey's a veteran journalist who previously covered politics for the Star Tribune, including Amy Klobuchar's presidential campaign. Just a word about the format. Each will talk for 20-25 minutes. Afterwards, there will be a 30-minute Q&A session, and then, as Mitch mentioned, we'll all go out and drink and be merry. I'm now going to turn it over to Chris.
All right. Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thanks to Humanists Minnesota for having me here today. What I want to do today is just try to run through kind of a first cut at my understanding of what happened in the 2022 midterms. Suzanne had asked me to pay some special attention to the role of religion, so I've got a few slides on that, although in some ways I actually think it was not especially important actually in these midterms, and so we can talk a little bit about why that might be the case. I'm going to be drawing on two main sources of data today. In part, I'll be talking about an exit poll that I ran with my students in the 2nd Congressional District, which, as many of you know, that was the Angie Craig, Tyler Kistner race, really competitive district, in a lot of ways a national sort of bellwether, and so I'll be drawing on some data from that race. And also using some data that I have from congressional races across the country. Every 2 years, I scrape every congressional website for candidates' texts, like the text off websites about different political issues. And so I can show some time trends with that, at least sort of my first cut at the data. So if we could go to the next slide. What I want to start by talking, I know this is a horrible PowerPoint slide, but I promise I'll talk about it and simplify things a little bit. What I did, because I knew I was going to be giving this talk and I wanted to prepare at least a little bit in advance, before the election, I put this together to sort of measure my expectations going into the election. And you'll see a couple things that stand out about this. So this is every midterm going back to 1994. And in the right-hand column, we have presidential seat change for the incumbent party. There's a lot of big negative numbers. As many of you probably know already, typically the president's party loses a lot of seats in midterm races. There's a variety of reasons for that, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. And there's a few exceptions as well. So if you'd highlight the first column, you'll notice that in 1998, the president's party did not lose seats. This was Bill Clinton's second administration, and Democrats gained a modest amount of seats in that. There were a variety of reasons for that. The economy was booming. That's that consumer sentiment score of 104 that I've highlighted there. So the economy was really doing well, and presidential popularity was high. This was sort of post-impeachment, and there was a lot of sympathy for Clinton in that election, and he was quite a popular incumbent president. In 2002, this was the post-9/11 midterm election, and George W. Bush was quite popular, and Republicans made some modest gains in the House. Okay. The question, though, is these exceptions aside, what's going to happen in 2022? This is what I was thinking going into the election, and if you show what consumer sentiment looked like, you can see it's really, really low. Americans are not feeling great about the state of the economy at this point in time, and Biden's popularity is not great either. And so we still don't know, I think, exactly what the balance of power is going to be in the House. We know that Democrats, and actually you can go to the next slide, that Democrats largely overperformed, though, relative to these expectations. So where do things sit? When we think about the big fundamentals, the things that tend to matter in elections, the first thing that might matter, and you can just start clicking through some of the animations if you want, the president's party loses seats, incumbent economic performance, and I put bars on the right because these are factors that I think strongly favored Republicans going into 2022. This is why you heard a lot of talk of a quote-unquote red wave. It's also the first election following congressional redistricting, and that brings with it a lot of uncertainty. But I think most analysts, and I would agree with this, Republicans tended to control a lot of state legislatures, and the thinking was that Republicans would have some slight redistricting advantages. Democrats managed to do the same thing in states like Illinois and Nevada to gerrymander in their own favor, but I would give like a little bit of advantage to Republicans going into that. Candidate quality, I would argue probably favored the Democrats in this race. Maybe I could have moved the candidate quality bar further to the left, particularly in some key Senate races like in Georgia. But candidate quality is one of those things that's really elusive and really difficult to define. And so I think there was some uncertainty that went with that. Democrats had some modest fundraising advantages. We should have taken that probably as a sign or a stronger indicator going into the election. And then finally, the big thing, and the thing that I want to talk a lot about today, is, and this is something I was talking about with my students going into the election, what are turnout operations going to look like, and what are the role of issues going to be going into this election, particularly abortion, which is on the minds of a lot of folks, but there were a lot of strategists who worried that maybe abortion had waned in the minds of sort of young progressives, and that it might not have the same types of turnout effects that it would have, 6 months prior. So what happened? In short, Democrats exceeded expectations both nationally and in Minnesota. I won't say a lot about Minnesota because that's Torey's job. I will say the Senate, is going to remain in Democratic control. Smaller than expected Republican gains in the House. And again, think back to that first PowerPoint slide where Democrats are losing 52 seats or 63 seats in some of these key races. The stage was set for that type of an election, and it did not materialize for Republicans. So, what happened? Go to the next slide. What explains this surprising result? Three things that I want to focus in on, and with the caveat that it's still early, and I'm sure there's a lot of storylines that are going to emerge in the next couple of months as analysts, including myself, sit down and look at this a little bit more closely. I'll show you some evidence today. First off, the Democrats went all in on abortion messaging, and that I think it was highly effective. I think it motivated a lot of voters to turn out and possibly even persuaded some Republican and independent voters who would typically vote Republican to rethink their vote choice. Number two, I'll show some evidence that Trump is still on the ballot. I think this is really important in the minds of voters, and for a variety of reasons, I think that ended up mattering in down-ticket races. You know, we showed the first slide that I showed, we were talking about incumbent economic performance. Well, we live in an interesting time where the incumbent is sort of in the shadow still of the former president. And so there are some reasons to suspect that maybe Trump's performance is more important than Biden's, as a matter of fact. And then finally, I just have some preliminary numbers on turnout. It wasn't the highest turnout midterm ever, but it was high enough that I think it certainly worked in Democrats' favor. Okay. So the first thing is that Democrats went all in on abortion messaging. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing every major party congressional campaign going back to 2008, blue lines for Democrats, red lines for Republicans. And what this is showing, the y-axis, is simply the percent of candidates who talked about abortion on their congressional campaign website. So, you know, you look up Angie Craig, you look up Tyler Kistner, you go to their website. Is there an issue page? Usually there's sort of a drop-down menu where you can click and learn their stances on the issues. I've gone through and done this for every candidate going back to 2008, so there's thousands upon thousands of little data points in there. And a couple interesting patterns stand out. First off, you can see the huge spike this year, where 65% of Democratic candidates are now talking about abortion. That was not the case even 2 years ago when that number was about 40%. So that's a huge change. I would also draw your attention to the fact that the line has been going up and up and up for Democrats since 2008. So clearly the Dobbs decision, I think, motivated some Democrats to change their messaging, but there's other things in the water as well. I think this probably is reflective of some broader changes in how candidates and the public are thinking about the quote-unquote culture war issues. And if I were to show LGBTQ issues on websites, the pattern for Democrats would look very similar. For Republicans, the story has not changed much. Republicans were sort of out-messaging Democrats on these issues in 2008, and that's no longer the case. Democrats clearly want to talk about abortion more. Turning from this, which is national data, every congressional candidate, to the 2nd Congressional District. So I had 26 students out on election day driving all around the 2nd Congressional District talking to voters. Did anybody get surveyed in here? No? Okay. That would be fun. So we were in a fairly representative, the sample skewed a little bit left, but it wasn't bad. This is a fairly representative sample in precincts from South St. Paul at the very northern tip of the 2nd District, all the way down to Montgomery, Minnesota, and Lonsdale, redder parts of the district. This is answers to a question about abortion, as you can see. So we asked people, should abortion be legal in all cases, most, illegal in most, or illegal in all? A couple things stand out here. First off, the public is clearly quite divided on the abortion issue. That shouldn't be surprising to anybody in here. But if you look at legal in all or legal in most, that adds up to like 95 or the low 90s in terms of percentage of voters among Craig voters. So clearly this is a public, Angie Craig supporters, Democratic supporters in this case, felt very, very strongly about this issue. Kistner voters were a little bit more divided. There's clearly, obviously, Tyler Kistner supporters were clearly more conservative with respect to abortion attitudes, but it's a much more divided electorate. And I think that's an important story to watch moving forward. This next slide will show a similar pattern. So this is just partisanship. So this is a 5-point party ID scale that we ask people. Are you a strong Democrat, strong Republican, something in between? And this is a different survey question asking if they disagree with or agree with the Dobbs decision that effectively overturned Roe v. Wade. And among strong and lean Democrats, again, you can see virtually all of those folks disagree with the Dobbs decision. 20% of strong Republicans. Like, I think that's 1 in 5. That's a pretty remarkable statistic, actually. And among those that lean Republican, the number is almost 40%. So I think there's some evidence of some cross-pressuring on the Dobbs decision. And again, I think that's going to be a really important issue to watch moving forward. Go to the next slide. I was asked to speak a little bit about the role of religion in the election. And I want to show two different, this is the results of some statistical modeling that I've kind of simplified a little bit. The two curves here, the green line are folks who do not attend worship services at all. It was like a 5-point question, how often do you attend worship services? The green line are folks who don't attend at all, and the orange line are folks who attend at least once a week. And on the y-axis, it's just the probability of a Kistner vote, again, based on a little statistical model. And then along the x-axis, it's just, are you strong Democrat or strong Republican? So the lines show what you would expect them to show. As you become more Republican, you're more likely to vote for the Republican candidate. That's not earth-shattering. The interesting thing about this graph is that there's actually a good deal of separation between these lines. That's sort of the takeaway message here, is that the orange line is on top, and that's a statistically significant gap, meaning that if you're a Republican who also attends church, the probability goes way the heck up that you would have supported the Republican congressional candidate in Minnesota's 2nd Congressional District. Okay, so that's noteworthy. Except, not so fast, right? If you just advance the slide 1 click, that gap completely disappears. It becomes statistically insignificant if I control for abortion attitudes. And so what this is suggestive of, and I think a lot deeper analysis would be necessary to really draw these conclusions, but what this is suggestive of to me is that abortion is resonating with religious communities in different ways. But at the end of the day, the religion gap we see is really just sort of a proxy or a stand-in for deeper divides in terms of attitudes about abortion access, reproductive freedom. Okay. I also took a look at, if you go one more slide, this is religious language. I just counted some really basic religious terms this is the same website data set that I showed before, God, prayer, Bible, etc. And religious messaging, I think there's a lot of concern about Christian nationalism and those types of ideas. Certainly they're out there. But among mainstream congressional candidates, these are all House candidates, we're not seeing a huge spike. Certainly it exists, but if we just kind of look at averages, most candidates, Republicans are higher than Democrats here. About half of Republican candidates make some sort of religious reference on their website. I also looked at explicitly Christian terms, like references to, say, Jesus, and the percentages are much, much lower, to the point where I thought it was a boring graph and I left it off. But I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. Not much of a spike in 2022. Okay, so that's the first thing is I think the abortion issue really, really mattered. And by the way, I looked at other issues. I looked at jobs because unemployment's low. I thought Democrats could have talked about that. I looked at a wide variety of issues, and I didn't see another spike as big as that abortion spike. I mean, I really think Democrats went all in. Point number 2, Trump is still on the ballot. We asked 2 interesting survey questions. The first one's pretty conventional. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Joe Biden is handling his job as president? This is like just on every exit poll, we're going to ask questions about incumbent performance. We also asked a question that I think was a little bit more novel. We said, did you approve of the way Donald Trump handled his job as president? And the interesting thing is that those 2 lines are virtually indistinguishable from each other. Voters are still thinking about Donald Trump. We would not expect this to be as predictive as it is. but Trump attitudes are almost indistinguishable from Biden attitudes, even though Trump hasn't been president for quite some time. Why is this the case? So if you go to the next slide, why is this the case? I mean, the news cycle is going to be part of the reason for that. And there's actually a lot. So this is the most important issue question, asking voters what's the most important issue facing the nation today. And there's a lot to digest here. You can see that among Kistner supporters, inflation was the most important issue. For Angie Craig supporters, abortion was a more important issue. I think those have gotten a lot of attention in the media already. The one that really stuck out to me here actually was the voting rights and election integrity bar. That's 13.7% of voters. I had 9 different options. That's probably actually a bad survey question. That's probably too many options. And even when given 9 different options, 13.7% of Angie Craig supporters said that voting rights or election integrity were the most important issue on the ballot. That was sort of a jaw-dropping moment for me. And actually, it was funny. I was talking to some students about this the other day who had helped me do the data entry, and they said, Professor Chapp, you got to go back and we got to redo all the data entry for this question. And I said, why? And they said, there's a lot that we couldn't even code because people had just written in democracy. And which is what we were trying to capture with that response option. And so, again, this is suggestive to me that the January 6th insurrection and Trump's antics following the election are really still resonating with people in a pretty powerful way. If you go to the next slide, so much to digest here. I'm moving pretty fast, but I'm happy to go back and reflect on any of this in the Q&A. Turnout was quite high. I think there we go. You can see not quite as high as 2018 turnout, at least based on the early estimates, but certainly high in key states. Minnesota, last I checked, I think it was number 2 in the country in terms of overall turnout at 62.8%. So we have really good midterm performance here. But this is something that mattered quite a bit. And I think it'll be really interesting in the coming weeks and months to look at what constituencies specifically were turning out to vote. Was it young people? There's some evidence to suggest that may have made a big difference in some key races. So, summing up, high Democratic numbers with low incumbent approval is very unusual. Like, dare I say, completely unprecedented. Why is this the case? One of 2 concluding thoughts that I'll leave you with is there's a phenomena that political scientists love to talk about. It's the idea of negative partisanship. The idea is that maybe we don't love our own party so much, but we really dislike the opposing party. And is there evidence that that was on voters' minds when they were casting their ballot? I think there's some. If you animate the graph, you'll see, so this is Angie Craig supporters only, okay? And you'll see among Angie Craig supporters, only just barely over 20%. This is a 4-point question, so you could strongly approve, somewhat disapprove, strongly. It's a 4-point question. Only 20% of Angie Craig supporters strongly approve of the job Joe Biden is doing as president. If you would have said that to me before the election, I would have said, like, Angie Craig's gonna have a really bad day for one. I mean, this just seems that lack of enthusiasm in the incumbent presidential administration should have been a really, really bad sign for Democrats. If you look at the percent that strongly approve of Donald Trump, though, it's almost 90%. That's the motivating factor. And so this, to me, speaks of negative partisanship, and I think it's a really key feature to think about when we're trying to process what happened in the 2022 midterms. The final thing I'll leave you with is that there are governance challenges moving forward. I think this is probably an understatement, and I'm sure Torey is going to talk more about this. We have a closely divided electorate, and that's what this graph shows. The next graph, you just hit one more, there we go. We asked people about the national economy. This is not a political question. This is just a question, is the economy getting better or worse? And as you can see, Angie Craig supporters, Tyler Kistner supporters were dramatically divided in their opinions just on how the economy is doing. right? We see the world, even we see the economic world through partisan colored glasses. And that's obviously going to raise any number of challenges for the electorate, for communities moving forward. There's also huge governance challenges. We're in a position now where at the latest count, we're going to have a Democratic-controlled Senate at the national level and Democratic administration in the presidency, and a very, very closely divided but Republican-controlled House. And I think that there are some serious challenges with how any governance is going to happen. If I had to make a prediction, I don't even think it's a bold prediction that we were going to see government shutdowns in our future. And so I think how we govern in this sort of divided environment is really one of the big questions for our times. So with that, I'll turn it over to Torey, and thank you for your attention.
Oh my gosh, that was so good. I was like taking pictures so I can ask you for the data later so we can put it in our newsletter. That was fascinating. And the Biden, both the Trump and the democracy and the Biden answers were really interesting. You know, Congresswoman Craig was notably absent when Vice President Kamala Harris came to town. She did not do any real campaigning with the Biden administration. And Tyler Kistner was hit quite a bit on 2020 election denier. He would repeatedly say, when we asked him, you know, do you believe in the integrity of the 2020 election? Do you think President Biden won the presidency? He had a kind of silly throwaway answer. He'd say, well, of course Biden's the president. Look at the economy. But he wouldn't really address it head on, and he had actually been involved in 2 lawsuits, as you remember, in 2020. One over his own election results and one over overall. So anyway, very interesting. Sorry. But we're going to talk about the state now, so we can get into more of that in the questions. Okay, so as I've been introduced, I'm Torey. We can go to the next slide. Suzanne already did a great job introducing Axios Twin Cities. By a show of hands, we're pretty new. Is anybody in this room? Oh, we have some readers. Great. Okay. We've already been introduced, but we did launch here in 2021, January, so we're a pretty new addition to the local media scene. We have grown to about 110,000 subscribers already, so for those of you who are not subscribed, you're missing out. Join us, and we cover our big picture. Our mandate is to get you smarter, faster about the news and issues and trends shaping life in the Twin Cities. As Suzanne mentioned, I write our politics coverage. Nick Halter, a former Business Journal reporter, does a lot of business and development coverage. So we've got a lot of scoops on what's being built, what's coming in, new restaurants, things like that. We have culture, lifestyle, things to do, event guides. Just today, our fall-winter issue came out with all of the winter arts and festivals. So join us. I put some flyers with a QR code out in the front. And we do everything in our trademark smart brevity style, and I'll try to do that with this presentation as well. The idea is we're not going to waste your time, kind of get straight to the point, lots of facts. We tell you why it matters, we tell you the big picture. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to try to not overlap too much with what Chris already said for the bigger terms here, but we'll just start with what we thought would happen on state government. For all of the reasons, the red wave, the anti-presidential incumbent effects often do trickle down to the state legislature as well. We found here in Minnesota, just like they do in the congressional level. So we thought there was going to be a red wave, and we thought it was going to hit Minnesota. We did think, a lot of reporters and analysts and polls did think that Governor Walz was going to win another term despite a potential red wave. We can talk more about that in the Q&A, but a lot of that had to do with his own popularity and then the messenger and the message of his rival, Scott Jensen, former state senator and a physician from Chaska, was the nominee. Dr. Jensen did not, he was being outraised by Governor Walz quite a bit. Most polls showed Governor Walz, 6, 7, 8, even one showed him 16 points up. Dr. Jensen was known as kind of a maverick in the state legislature, moderate. He did take a hard pivot right to win the Republican endorsement on some key issues, including abortion, where he embraced a full ban ahead of the Republican endorsement. And we can talk about that if there are questions about that in the Q&A, kind of the role of Republicans' endorsement process here plays in their candidate selection and then the general election. But so for a lot of reasons, we thought Governor Walz would probably win despite the headwinds. We did not think, a lot of people, in conventional wisdom, I'm just using we, not me, but just generally, was that the Attorney General and the Auditor's Office might go Republican. And that would have been huge because Republicans have not won statewide in Minnesota since 2006. So for a variety of factors we can get more into later, combination of this red wave, combination of crime as an issue on voters' minds, Auditor's campaign kind of being down ballot, a little bit more of a generic D versus R race. And then on both of these races, we had kind of the Feeding Our Future scandal kind of come into play in the end. So polling suggested that DFL incumbents Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, and Julie Blaha, the state auditor, were in big trouble. And we thought there would be at least a divided legislature, if not a full Republican legislature. There were a lot of signs that thought, for all of these reasons that Chris talked about, essentially, that Republicans would at least hold the Senate, and Republicans thought they had a very good chance of flipping the House and winning the House back. So that is what we thought going into the election. And next slide. What actually happened was not that. The DFL swept this election. They secured a trifecta control at the legislature. It's the first time since 2013-2014 session that one party controls the governor's office, the House, and the Senate. Walz won by about what the polls said, so the polls were right on that. The AG and the auditor's race were very narrow. These were like a percentage point difference. And so Republicans came very, very close to winning those seats, but they weren't pulled over the line. As I mentioned, the DFL flips the Senate, and the narrowly won one seat, and the Democrats maintained a majority in the House. And we can talk about this one more later and in the Q&A, but also it was a surprise to some that Mary Moriarty, the incoming Hennepin County attorney, not only won, but won by a significant margin. And she won not only in the Twin Cities and in Minneapolis, but she won in some suburban areas, some suburban cities. She won by fairly strong margins as well. And that was kind of notable because Mary, there was a lot of talk heading into the election about crime and concerns about crime being a top issue for voters, and that was something that a lot of people thought would help Republicans. The Hennepin County attorney's race was two Democrats running. Mary was the DFL endorsed candidate, but two self-identified Democrats running. But it was really a reformer versus a law and order message. Judge Martha Holden Dimmick, who was the candidate on the other side, was running on it. I'm going to crack down on violent crime. I am going to address this. We're going to have, tougher sentences. We're going to address carjacking, all of these things. And Mary Moriarty, former chief public defender, she's a reformer, and she came in and said, we want more restorative justice. We want more alternatives to prison sentencing. And she performed very well, including in communities that I think Chris would say too, polling and conventional wisdom would suggest may have been more open to the law and order message. So we can go to the next. So what happened? Some of the factors that potentially fueled Democrats' wins. We don't know yet, really. There's some ways where elections go we won't really ever fully know, but Chris talked about this quite a bit already, abortion versus inflation and crime. There was some of the polling, conventional wisdom, national media, and anecdotes nationally and locally were suggesting that, and consultants and talking heads were projecting that abortion had peaked early for Democrats, that the timing with when the Dobbs ruling was and the leak, that the issue had really angered voters, particularly on the left and potentially suburban swing women voters in particular, that issue had peaked and it had kind of started to not be as important to voters, and they were coming home in the end to pocketbook issues and crime, and that would help Republicans. That's something I heard actually from candidates on both sides of the aisle, legislative candidates, in the weeks coming up to the election. Some Democrats were saying, we're still hearing about abortion at the doors, but we're not hearing about it as much as we were before. And we're also hearing about these other issues. Whereas, July, August, it was like the number one Republicans and Democrats would tell you. Any door you knocked on in the suburbs, you're most likely going to have someone ask you what your position was on abortion. So, there was some evidence that heading into the election that we thought that maybe abortion wouldn't be a top issue, and now these results suggest that, in fact, they were. One race to look to on that is Senator Kelly Morrison. Well, she's a representative now, but in the West Metro, she won a swing district by quite a wide margin. She is an OBGYN, abortion access and rights was a big issue for her. So Democrats have said when they saw those returns early in the night in the West Metro and they saw how much Kelly Morrison was going to win by, that's when they kind of knew that this might be a better night than we thought. Democrats have a big cash advantage. This is not new. Democrats have for years had a huge cash advantage in Minnesota. Groups like Alliance for a Better Minnesota spend heavily. They spent very heavily this time. Early on, they got out early. They defined Scott Jensen on abortion. You probably saw some of the ads. You saw a lot of 2nd Congressional District ads too, if you ever turned on the TV. But there were a lot of ads just saying, Scott Jensen wants to ban abortion. Scott Jensen wants to ban abortion. Scott Jensen wants to ban abortion. And they were able to just flood the airways with that message. And Dr. Jensen has since said, yeah, there was nothing I could do to recover from that. I mean, I think they went up in maybe August, ABMs on the airwaves, and Jensen did not have the money to counter with his message. He did try to pivot and say, well, first they said abortion is not on the ballot in Minnesota. There's a 1995 state Supreme Court decision, Doe versus Gomez, which provides a constitutional right to an abortion in Minnesota. So Jensen said, first he said, oh, it's not on the ballot, it's protected, so it doesn't really matter. And then he started saying, actually, I do support all of these exceptions for abortion. So, he tried to pivot back, and the message was already out there. There was some Republican money that came in. There was a lot of Republican money on the AG's race in particular, and for the state legislature. At the end, the Republican Governors Association spent about $1.5 million on ads targeting Tim Walz to support Jensen. Those were mostly crime message ads, but that money was perhaps too little too late for the Republicans. On the money, I'd also mention when Chris was talking about democracy, and elections being such a big issue for voters, there was a probably unprecedented amount of spending in the Secretary of State's race, where incumbent Steve Simon was running against Kim Crockett. She is a lawyer, conservative activist at a think tank who has questioned repeatedly the 2020 election, and there was a lot of spending, which is unusual for that race, with TV ads, calling Kim Crockett an election denier, talking about election issues. So I don't know if that trickled down to other races, but that was in there. Hennepin and Ramsey counties, Republicans, in order to win statewide in Minnesota and in order to control the legislature, need to perform well in Hennepin and Ramsey counties in the suburbs. It's just math. Some Republicans, down ballot Republicans, had told me they needed to crack 35% in order to in the Hennepin and Ramsey counties in order to win statewide. They didn't do that. You can see, I don't have my glasses, but I think Walz won over 70% in Hennepin County in particular. So, the down ballot candidates, Ryan Wilson for state auditor, Jim Schultz for AG, who came closest, those two campaigned together quite a bit in the metro. Perhaps it's why their races were so close, but Jensen, and he has acknowledged this too in some of his post-mortem, post-election interviews, just did not win those voters. And Democrats organized very heavily in the Twin Cities. You had a lot of organizing on campus at the University of Minnesota. Mary Moriarty's campaign was out knocking a lot of doors. U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders came to town. Vice President Kamala Harris came to town. There were some other members of the squad who came and campaigned with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Democrats did a very good job turning out their voters in Minneapolis and St. Paul. No top of the ticket coattails. I've kind of referenced this already. Scott Jensen did not perform strongly enough to win or really to come close to winning against Governor Tim Walz, and that hurts Republicans down ballot. I think if the margin was 2 points closer in the governor's race, I think you'd have a Republican attorney general and a Republican state auditor, and the Republicans might have had control of at least one chamber. But because there was that gap on the top of the ticket, Minnesotans do like to split ticket vote, but they didn't have, the Jensen campaign to pull out more Republicans or pull more voters out to the Republican side. The DFL is back on the doors. In 2020, some of you might recall, or most Democratic campaigns did not knock doors in 2020 because of the pandemic. They made a choice that, health concerns outweighed the strategic political benefit in doing face-to-face campaigning. That was different this year, and a lot of top Democrats, including the party chair, had said, they essentially said that they lost the state Senate narrowly in 2020 because they weren't on the doors. Door knocking is really important in political campaigns, especially in state legislative races, because the thought is that it insulates the candidates from attacks later. So you meet someone, maybe you meet them more than once, maybe you don't agree with them on everything, but they seem really reasonable, they seem smart, they did talk about some things you cared about, they seem like a nice guy or a nice gal, and then the mailer shows up in your box that says, this person is Satan, and you're like, wait a second, that's not true, I don't think that, and so it kind of like protects you from those attacks, they were out on the doors this time, and it also helps get out the vote. It's almost like you can't really poll state legislative districts well, so it's a little bit of a snap vote about a snap poll about voters and how they're feeling and what's connecting and what's not. So Democrats have traditionally outperformed Republicans on GOTV and door knocking in Minnesota because they have more money, better infrastructure, a lot of labor union allies to provide bodies, people to go out and knock those doors. And this time, the state Senate campaign director said that they knocked over 500,000 doors in Minnesota, and 40,000 of those came in the final days of the campaign. And you had, incumbents in safe seats or candidates in safe seats were knocking in their own districts on behalf of them and the rest of the Democratic ticket, the statewide candidates, and then they were going everywhere else. They were going and helping out in the swing districts. And so that probably did make a difference. And of course, redistricting. House Speaker Melissa Hortman, a Democrat, had been saying since the beginning that she thought the maps were pretty good for them. I think Republicans still thought they had a good chance on the House maps because even if enough seats in the suburbs were seats that Biden would have won, that sort of anti-presidential incumbent backlash, they thought that the margins for Biden were not big enough that it would guarantee Democrats victory. Back in 2020, a lot of state legislative Republicans, a number in the metro area, outperformed President Trump by 9, 10, 11 points because of the split ticketing. So I think Republicans still thought they had an opportunity, but the seats, the map was not bad for Democrats. And then you had some situations like an incumbent versus incumbent battle in Anoka-Coon Rapids area, where, it was Democrat Zach Stevenson and Republican John Heitzman, and you've got two incumbents because of redistricting who have to run against each other, and it was kind of one of those swing seats that would help determine the control of the House. And it's about a third of each of their districts that they had represented before drawn into this new seat. But Zach Stevenson kept a lot of the areas that were good for him, and John Heitzman lost some of the areas that were good for him. So, redistricting does have a net effect. Of course, here in Minnesota, it's a little bit different than some of the other states that Chris mentioned because our maps are drawn by an independent judicial panel again this time, not by the legislature, so it wasn't like a partisan gerrymandering, but the redistricting for the state legislative races certainly didn't hurt Democrats, and it turns out it might have helped them. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so what is next? What does it mean? Well, it means that when we get the legislature comes back in January, Democrats have full control of the state legislature, the governor's office, the House, and the Senate. The big picture is it is a budget year. There is a lot of money to spend. The last figure that was floating out there for the projected surplus was like $12 billion over the next couple of years. You might recall there were a lot of discussions about how to spend some of that money last spring, and the divided legislature could not agree. That's actually context I probably should have said from the start. Hopefully most of you know that as it stands now, or this past year, Republicans controlled the Senate, Democrats the House. So they really didn't get a lot done. So there's even more on the table to spend because they didn't come to an agreement on how to spend it last time. And you know, that's not just the budget decisions impact policy a lot because policy takes money to implement. So, you know, everything from public safety spending to paid family leave to schools, like all of that gets wrapped up in the budget process. Health and Human Services is a huge part of the budget. So Democrats get to have, you know, Republicans no longer have a real seat at the table in deciding how to spend that. And one kind of interesting flashback to note is that, you know, the big divide last spring over spending the surplus was how to give it back to Minnesotans. Governor Tim Walz wanted to do what he called Walz checks, you know, a direct payments to Minnesota taxpayers, like a rebate. Republicans didn't like that idea, and actually, frankly, House Democrats didn't like that idea really either. Democrats wanted to do more targeted tax cuts and then spend on more kind of social programs. Republicans wanted what they call permanent ongoing tax relief. They wanted a basic income tax cut. And you know, the sides, they almost came together on a tax deal. They couldn't come together on other things. They actually did reach a tax deal, but it didn't end up passing with the other pieces. But Republicans kind of made a bet last year, Senate Republicans, that if they held out and they didn't strike a deal with Democrats on these other issues to get the tax cuts that Democrats would agree to, that they would be in at least as good of a position, if not more of a position, a better position this year. So they thought, you know, we're probably going to win. We're probably going to hold the Senate. We might win back the House. Maybe we'll win the governorship. You know, maybe not. But they thought that they might have more chips to play this coming session, and that they would be able to get all the tax cuts they want potentially if they held off instead of, you know, reached a deal, a compromise with Democrats. That didn't end up working out for them. It's just kind of a bet they took, and now they do not have a seat at the table for that. DFL leaders have pledged action on abortion rights. Speaker Melissa Hortman has said that codifying abortion rights, there's something called the PRO Act that's out there. Even though there's the state Supreme Court ruling, they want to put it in state law that, you know, a person has autonomy over their bodily decisions, essentially, reproductive decisions. So that is something to watch. One kind of interesting note is that even though there was a DFL majority in the House before this election, there was not a pro-abortion rights majority. There were a number of Democrats in the state legislature and the state House in particular who did not support abortion rights, and so it wasn't something that was going to move before. Speaker Hortman says that is no longer the case due to some of the areas where Democrats gained seats, due to some of the retirements. She says that, you know, 68, enough of her members support abortion rights to pass this. The Senate leadership also says that they have a pro-choice majority. Lots of things have been floated in the wish list. Frankly, the day after the election, it seemed like Senate Democrats were just as surprised as some of the analysts that they won. So when we had a press conference with them, you know, there wasn't a real clear sense of what are you going to do with this majority? What are you going to pass first? Because they had to meet as a caucus. But ideas floated: paid family leave, more school funding, Social Security income tax cuts is actually something that several Democrats in key races campaigned on. That might be on the table. Marijuana legislation. Speaker Hortman has also said climate change, gun violence, laws targeting gun violence. So there's a lot of issues that, you know, either the DFL-controlled House passed and then stalled in the Senate in recent years, or that have been on DFL wish lists for a while that have not moved, and now they can move that. They can move on those. You know, they know that these bills will at least get a hearing in the House, in the Senate, and have a chance at passage. Of course, there's a DFL governor who is more likely to sign them than a Republican. Walz wants his Walz checks back. He wants to use some of the surplus for, you know, rebates for taxpayers. new commissioner confirmations, so there's going to be some turnover in Governor Walz's cabinets, a number of key people, including Jan Malcolm, the Department of Health Commissioner who oversaw the COVID response, John Harrington, Public Safety, Education Commissioner Heather Mueller. All of these people are retiring midterm. That's not, or ahead of the new term. That's not super unusual for there to be turnover, but previously Governor Walz was appointing commissioners under the threat of them potentially being denied by the Republican or rejected by the Republican Senate. The Senate does have confirmation power in Minnesota, like at the federal level. So, it gives the governor a little bit more room potentially to, in his nominations, to know that there's not this more looming threat of rejection. The Senate did actually reject a handful of his nominees fairly recently. Yeah, the big yes, but that's something we like to use in Axios. This is not going to be Democrats, merrily skipping along, holding hands, passing everything that particularly, more progressive Democrats have wanted to see passed. It's a very, very narrow majority in the Senate. That's a one-seat majority. That means everybody has to be on board for things to pass. And you have a lot of geographic and ideological diversity in the state Senate and the DFL caucus. You have 2 Democratic socialists elected here in the Twin Cities. You have a member that won narrowly in the Iron Range, which has been trending red in recent years, and mining and other issues, he may split with others in the party. And you have some more moderate members in the suburbs and in the outer ring suburbs. And so, there's still going to be, I think the new Senate leader, Carrie Dietzich of Minneapolis, is still kind of feeling out her caucus and where they are on different issues. But there's still going to be a lot of negotiating. There's going to be some political infighting. I think it's more likely that more bills are going to pass, certainly, than they did under the divided legislature. But what shape they'll take is to be seen. Even something like paid family leave, and both paid family leave and marijuana legalization are very complicated issues, and paid family leave is very expensive. The price tag is like $1 billion to get it up and running, or was during when they discussed it previously. So all of these issues are going to take a little while to work out. As a recap, the legislature meets from January to May. If they finish on time, late May, they almost never finish on time. Like journalists, they love a deadline. Unlike journalists, they blow their deadlines. But I think that they'll be going, I think on some of these bigger and more complicated issues, that it will take all 4 months to figure it out. Areas just of quick, what to expect, like immediate action on potentially. I would say not full marijuana legalization, but the THC edibles regulation. That's something that passed with little fanfare, or it turns out understanding by legislators about what they were actually doing. As you might have heard or read, there's been a lot of questions about enforcement or lack of enforcement, lack of regulation, and I think lawmakers on both sides have said they want to look at that and create a little bit more structure around that wild west of a legalized edibles market. As I mentioned, the speaker has said that the PRO Act is going to be one of the first bills she brings up, or something codifying abortion rights, so I would watch for that early on. And the other wild card to throw out there, and this is somewhere where Republicans will have some power and control of the legislature, is a bonding bill. The divided legislature did not get done a bonding bill. That's the approved borrowing for public infrastructure construction projects. And there's a laundry list. Every lawmaker has their list of projects their district wants funded, and there's a lot of backlogged maintenance on everything from universities to water treatment to all of these different public roads, all of these different things. So I think there will be appetite for a bonding bill, but there will have to be agreement that it requires over a majority to pass. So that's something where Republicans will have a little sway. I may have another slide. I'm trying to remember if we go. Oh, my last slide says to subscribe. I think I touched on everything I was going to touch on. But yeah, the legislature returns January 3rd, right after the new year. The leaders have been elected. That's the other thing to note, is that Both leaders of the majority caucuses are from the Metro. Melissa Hortman is from Brooklyn Park. Carrie Dietzig is from Minneapolis, Northeast Minneapolis. The Republicans also elected new leaders. So Melissa Hortman started the speaker, but Republicans also elected new leadership. And so there's going to also be like a change in dynamic at the legislature in terms of the personalities involved in the negotiations. So hopefully that gives you a little sense. To recap, they thought it was going to be a better night than Republicans, than it was. And now Democrats have all the power as it stands now. So we'll take questions now. Should we turn this one off and do our laughs? Okay. I don't know.
Thank you so much. Hello?
Let's see if this one goes.
Okay. This is where people are going to ask questions. That's why I wanted to get it up and working. So if you would like to ask a question, could you please come up? We'll have a little line here. Anybody who wants to ask a question. I'm going to, while people are lining up, I'm going to ask a question. It has to do with crime. I have to say I was really surprised, Chris, at your exit polling showing how low the issue of crime rated with voters, and then you can see in the results, which Torey talked about with Mary Moriarty and Keith Ellison, crime didn't seem to be as big an issue as you might have expected. Did this show up, Chris, in other congressional races around the country, or is this a Minnesota thing? We just don't, crime is not a high issue for us.
Yeah, so my understanding, is this, can folks hear me?
Yeah, they're on. I turned mine on. Is mine on? Yes. Okay. Yeah, you have to do the little button on the top.
Hello?
Do it unmute. Yeah. It's like Zoom, but in person. Yeah, unmute.
Check.
You gonna use mine? You can just pass it back and forth.
I can use professor voice too.
Okay.
Can everybody hear me?
want to do it for online.
Oh, for online, sure, thanks. So, so I should have actually called attention to that in the most important issue question. Crime was remarkably unimportant among Tyler Kistner supporters. We could even bring the slide back up if you wanted. It was, I think, among Kistner supporters, maybe 7.5% said crime was the most important issue. And relative to the amount of money that was spent on advertising, I would say they did not get a lot of bang for their buck. With that, my sense is that the same thing held true nationwide. Why is that the case? In part, you always have to measure the effectiveness of these ads against sort of objective circumstances. And in part, I just think that there were other issues that were a lot more important to voters. Republicans had some effective advertising with respect to inflation and the state of the economy. I think it probably would have made sense to double down on that even to a greater extent and maybe have a more consistent message rather than have these two sort of messaging channels, inflation, but also crime. But I think you're absolutely right that it didn't seem to resonate at all, and people were really surprised by that.
Another kind of theory that I've heard from some strategists and insider types analyzing this is that Republicans in Minnesota in particular maybe went too, not outlandish, but almost like a little bit cartoonish in some of the crime. There was a lot of talk around the Minneapolis being a hellhole. There was a lot of imagery in the ads about the unrest, the civil unrest that followed George Floyd's murder and the burning of the 3rd precinct. There are certainly concerns that residents and folks who work in Minneapolis or St. Paul have about, crimes or carjackings or things like that. But I think most people maybe come in for a concert or a Twins game or go to the office, and it's not a hellhole, right? So there was some, and the ads, the late ads on the from the Republican Governors Association actually got an F from fact checkers for some of their depictions of the Twin Cities on that mark. So I have heard a little bit, and I think that it's true that some of these other issues just ended up outranking it, especially if you're someone in a suburb and you generally feel safe in your community, right? Maybe it's not going to be that top issue for you in the end, but there was some thought that maybe Republicans in Minnesota overplayed their hand a little bit with the tone or the nature of the ads and like the outrageousness of them. There was another Scott Jensen ad where someone's being carjacked, right? And so I don't know if that is true, but that was certainly some of the takeaways. And then on the Hennepin County Attorney's race, I think Mary Moriarty ran a very strong campaign. She had a good ground game. She's ran a positive campaign. She had more people, I think, out, volunteers, outdoor knocking, things like that, than Martha Holton Dimmick did. And it's also possible that voters in Hennepin County were expressing that they, did want changes to the criminal justice system. This has been a parallel conversation in Minneapolis in the wake of George Floyd's killing, holding more officers accountable, addressing kind of MPD corruption, having more racially just criminal justice system is something that's been on the people's minds for the past 2 years. And so it's possible that was also a factor in that race in particular.
Could I- One other thing, I think it's just also important to remember that anytime we talk about issue voting, there's a difference between voting based on an issue and rationalizing your vote in terms of an issue. And so the question is, for a strong Republican or a strong Democrat, are they really going to change their mind? I'm sure Joe Biden's among strong Republicans is getting negative marks with respect to his handling of crime, whatever that means. But I don't think people are really changing their minds. I think abortion had the potential to drive voters to the polls, to actually motivate people to turn out who might have otherwise not turned out. And I think that's the difference between those two types of issues.
And the one other thing I would add on the Attorney General's race is the state Attorney General actually has very minimal jurisdiction over crime. The Attorney General has a small criminal division that can help county attorneys at their request with criminal prosecutions. And it's more of like a consumer protection and being the lawyer of the state type role. Jim Schultz made his race all about crime and addressing crime. He wanted to triple the size of that division to take on more prosecutions. It's mostly small rural offices that ask for help when they have a murder or something that's really unusual in their parts. So, Keith Ellison was focused on abortion, and abortion is something that you could argue that there may be a little bit more the Attorney General could do on. I mean, still not kind of central to their mandate, but that's another way in which crime maybe was an issue, but maybe voters recognized by the end that even if I'm concerned about crime, like the Attorney General isn't the one that's going to fix that for me. I don't know if voters were that rational, but that's just something to think about.
So based on my own observation and what I've been reading, it appears to me that the American voters by and large rejected extremism. You had a lot of extremist candidates at state levels and national levels, AGs, governors, who were largely rejected by the voters, which I think to me was a sign that voters really want a return to more normalcy and kind of more moderate government and more moderate governance. I'm not sure that Speaker McCarthy and Mitch McConnell got the memo because they're still really on track to do some kind of extremist things. But I'm more interested in the House because some are saying that Kevin McCarthy may have difficulties getting his caucus together because you have a number of moderate Republicans who were either incumbents who were reelected or new more moderate members, more moderate Republicans who were elected to the House. And you still have this kind of extremist hardcore right wing there. And some are concerned that he may not be able to get his caucus together to vote together and to pursue their own agenda. I am inclined to disagree with that because I think particularly people who are newly elected are going to not really be crazy about the idea of bucking the speaker, who's very powerful and makes all the committee assignments, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just curious, what would be your take on what's going to happen in the House in terms of the Republican caucus and Kevin McCarthy's ability to get them all together and push forward the agenda he has?
I do think that governance is going to be a challenge. And even, to bring up the observation you made about the speaker making committee assignments. Right now, there's a lot of Republicans, particularly Freedom Caucus Republicans, who are trying to extract concessions from McCarthy to make those types of procedures more difficult, including allowing committees to elect their own chairs. So whether or not this happens, we'll have to wait and see. But I think McCarthy has some really, he has a challenging road ahead of him. I think some of the messaging out of more moderate Republicans, relatively speaking, in the House, and I don't think there's many, but like Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, Don Bacon from Nebraska, have made comments, on the order of, this isn't going to be a perfect quote, but on the order of sort of, we're all Joe Manchins now, right? We all have the potential. And I think getting those sorts of relatively more moderate Republicans on the same page with their more, sort of extreme counterparts is going to be a pretty big challenge. And then, of course, ultimately, the House would need to pass a bill that would also be acceptable to the Senate. And so, I do think that there's some really governance. We almost had it. There are some really big governance challenges ahead, and so,
Yeah, you're in a better position to speak to that. I would just flag the local angle on all of that is that Congressman Tom Emmer from Minnesota is on track to be the whip. So it's kind of going to be his job to get Republicans all on the same page and count the votes and get the votes for the GOP's priorities and potentially Speaker McCarthy, if it is his majority's agenda in the House. But on what you mentioned about maybe voters expressing that they wanted to return to normalcy, less extremism, on the state level, that is something that we have heard state Democrats reflect upon from these election results. And the state Senate, new state Senate leadership, Democrats, that's something they said the day after the election. This is Minnesotans rejecting extremism, rejecting the far right or the polarized, and they thought that the results, and particularly the narrow majorities, were not a mandate to, run wild with the DFL's wish list, but to govern, even though they have a majority, with, kind of a moderate path in mind. And I would also note on that, Chris had mentioned on the congressional level, candidate quality being a factor. That's also a factor, of course, in state races, and due in part to their endorsement process, Republicans could have had some races where they could have had a better candidate, certainly, and a more extreme candidate did come out of the primary process or the endorsement process. And in the Senate, they actually elected a number of, the Senate Republican caucus is going to be farther to the right than it was in the past due to some of those primaries and the candidate endorsement process. But, I do think that there were a number of candidates who served on the Republican side that were quite a bit more conservative than you would expect for a candidate running in a swing district. There was an NPR story that about 1 in 4 of the GOP state legislative candidates running had in some way, shape, or form rejected or questioned the 2020 election results. So I do think that those issues that you're bringing up on the national level also reverberated down into the state races.
So right now in Minnesota, we have 4 congressional districts that are Republican and 4 Democrat. Do you think that might change in 2 years? Do you think that might change in 6 years? And if that happens, which congressional district might switch to Democrat and which might switch to Republican? Just thinking about it.
The last time I made a prediction was 2016. And so I'm out of the prediction business. The first and the second are both interesting districts for different reasons. I think I'm going to try to I'm going to try to maybe take your question and pivot a little bit. Just to say, I think one of the really interesting things that's happening in Minnesota, and it's reflective of patterns across the country, is just the changing sort of demographic portrait of the electorate. The suburbs are really interesting. So in the 2nd congressional district, the bluing of the suburbs is really a fascinating trend, and this is happening across the country, where the suburbs are changing. I think it's really important to watch what's happening with different demographic groups. Right now, people of color are voting for Democrats very consistently, but there's some signs that might not always be the case. Particularly parts of the Latinx electorate are moving more Republican, depending on the state you're in. And so what I would suggest is, without making a prediction, is just to say to really watch sort of the constituencies of the two parties and see how those are changing in the coming years. And I think that'll probably foretell what happens in some of the more competitive districts.
Yeah, and I mean, think back to 2018, there were 4 or 5 competitive congressional districts in Minnesota. And this time there was one, the second. The second was the only competitive congressional district, and that was a combination of factors. Swinging voter groups, the metro becoming more blue, greater Minnesota, trending more red, things like retirements. Colin Peterson had held a Trump plus 30 district, and he retired, and now that's a very safe seat for Republicans. And Michelle Fischbach, Dean Phillips flipped the West Metro 3rd Congressional District in 2018. That had not been a Democratic whole district since, Jerry, you've noticed that, in 1962, right? Yeah. Somewhere around there, 1962. So, and he won by, it was not even close. There was no money spent on the Republican side. That is a safe blue district now, and that was not a safe, he did well in 2020 as well, but that was, at the time in 2018, one of the most expensive races in Minnesota history for congressional. So really the second is the sole remaining true swing seat. Angie Craig did quite well this time, as your results showed. There was not a third-party legal marijuana candidate on the ballot, which I think was also there was a candidate on the ballot, but she had unfortunately passed away during the election, so she was not campaigning, and she got a much smaller share of the vote than she had gotten and the 2020 candidate had gotten. If the marijuana parties aren't as big of a factor, I think that Craig is in a pretty good spot now, she'll be running for her 4th term.
Yeah.
The first, you and I were talking about this before, Jerry, I think the first probably more likely than the 8th to become more of a swing district again, but Jeff Ettinger, the Hormel CEO who ran on the Democrat side and self-funded to the tune of, I think, probably more than $1 million, he's about as good of a candidate you're going to get down there, except for Dan Feehan, who was the person who ran twice before against Congressman Hagedorn, and I think that Brad Finstad, the Republican incumbent now, first-term freshman representative, he's also a very good candidate for that district. I think he fits the district, and he has a lot less, perhaps, personal baggage and political baggage than the late Congressman Jim Hagedorn did, who died of cancer in February. So I think that's going to be a hard one right now for Democrats to win back, and though a presidential year could be a factor, I'm just kind of rambling now, population growth in Rochester, could help Democrats, but Brad Finstad, I think, is going to be hard to beat if he plays his cards right and represents that district well.
Yeah. I was going to just chime in on population growth in Rochester. That's the only thing, maybe by the end of the decade, where you might start to, or a blue wave. So we saw what happened, and that's why I don't make predictions. But you saw what happened, in 2008 when Obama brought all sorts of new voters into the electorate that hadn't been there before. So barring something like that.
Let's say that President Biden doesn't run for re-election and U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar jumps in the presidential race and somehow becomes the nominee. That's a situation where maybe the first flips, because she's going to be a popular top of the ticket in Minnesota. She, wins by wide margins, even in areas Republicans win. So, it could happen, but that's kind of, it's interesting. There's just not as many competitive seats. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. I've got a real quick question.
Yeah.
How many seats in the legislature did the metro area pick up as a result of redistricting?
I haven't done that math. I wish I could tell you exactly how many. And it's hard to do that math on how many they pick up, because they're all new seats. So you can't do we flipped this many seats, because they're all new. Like Zach Stevenson, who I mentioned in the incumbent race in Coon Rapids and Anoka, is that a hold or a pickup, right? Because he's running, but it's also the other person's. I mean, they certainly in the Senate flipped a number of key seats. They held seats in St. Cloud area too. That was also influential. But the seats that may have won it for them were actually not in the metro. It was in the Moorhead area and then in the Iron Range. Some kind of unexpected wins.
And I was just thinking about the number of seats
Yeah.
in the metro area. Forget about who won them or anything. Just did the metro area pick up much power because of the
I don't have
census?
those numbers memorized, but that is something that Speaker Melissa Hortman had argued when the maps came out. She argued that in general, what you're seeing is trends, political and demographic trends, and population growth is pulling even more political power into the metro because, of course, all of the districts are drawn based on population. So as population grows in the metro and declines in other parts of the state, Democrats are by nature going to pick up more seats potentially or get seats that look a little better for them. But unfortunately, I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. But but it was a factor. It certainly was a factor.
I was thinking about, I have connection to 2 districts.
Yep.
And in northern Minnesota, they had to find 5,000 people for the Senate, state Senate district, and here my district, they had to lose 9,500.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a pretty big shift, right? And that's just 2 districts, but still,
it's
the
certainly a factor.
power must be concentrating in the metro area at
It
a pretty
is.
rapid rate, I would
is,
think.
And redistricting only happens every 10 years. So yes, it was, that was what Speaker Melissa Hortman had been saying from the get-go. Is I think this is good for me. I think that the more seats, having to divvy up the metro into more seats and greater Minnesota into fewer seats helps us. Population growth in Rochester also comes into play here. There's at least one seat I think that Republicans just gave up on because as Olmsted County grows and there's more DFL seats there, more to carve up there versus the Iron Range, right? The Iron Range lost a seat because of losing population. That might have been one of the districts you were talking about. So there's fewer seats up there. So that's a good point though. I'm sorry I don't have the numbers for you.
Just want to say our question and answer period is almost up, but we have time for a couple more, maybe 5 more minutes of Q&A. So I think Audrey's in line.
All right, I want to live in a perfect world. And it certainly doesn't exist now, and it's never going to. But one of the things is I'm very frustrated. This may be a little pivoting from what you guys really want to talk about, but the problem with polling and the problem with messaging and what gets talked about. So everyone's talking about, like, the polls become the news. And I get frustrated by that. But then also, we talk about how we can speak negatively about our opponents. Like an abortion, yes, that was really a crucial issue. But what's really more important is the environment right now and global warming. And nobody was talking about it. And so I guess I want to ask, what role does the news media have? And even people who are political scientists who are studying this, how do we get the public's attention upon what's really important as opposed to what will just help us successfully attack our opponents? Do you have anything to say about that?
There's a lot there. Let me try to answer it in a couple of different ways. So about polling, polling firms right now are doing a lot of autopsies. The American Association of Public Opinion Research, who has really smart people and who are really just trying to get it right, released a huge autopsy after the 2020 election, which had some pretty abysmal polling, actually, and I think misled folks in a lot of different ways, a lot of prognosticators. And I think things were better in 2022. relative to 2020. I think maybe the spirit of the question, though, is even more. So, long story short, I would say, vote your conscience and don't pay much attention to it. I do think that there's useful information there, and I do think that politicians, gather things about mandates and so on and so forth. And so I actually think that there's some important governance functions to polling as well. Maybe the spirit of the question, though, has to do with why are we just so fixated on it? If I bet this might be some commentary on journalism, which I have tremendous respect for the work you do. I do think, my own view from afar is that journalists are oftentimes under attack and need to work very hard to to project the values of objectivity and autonomy. And by reporting on a horse race, which, I agree with the spirit of the question, might not be the most important thing. But by reporting on a horse race, we're able to maintain objectivity, because we're saying, well, look, this is what the numbers are showing. This is where it's at. We're not saying that this party's right or that party's wrong. And so I think, polling can be a convenient thing to report on in some ways. But to the extent that we, can be maybe more reflective as well, and I think you've seen a lot of journalists start to call out, well, this is fact-checking websites, for example, or saying, yeah, this was untrue, or calling something a lie. I think that's really like an important development, actually, in the news media. So. The final part of your question, about what voters actually care about, is really, a hugely important question, and it's something that political scientists spend a lot of time thinking about. Let me say something that you'll probably find really discouraging, and I'm sorry, but I think most voters are not strong issue voters. Partisan identity is really the thing that matters for voters when they're going to the polls. This identity is just so critically important. And so, one important thing that people can do is not just vote, but also get involved, to get involved in governance and to get involved in shaping a party's agenda. Because, voters are going to vote their partisan identities, and then what the parties do once they've attained power is really what's important.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you just said. The polling in Minnesota actually was not bad this time. Yeah. It was pretty good. It was better than before, but there's a reckoning, as Chris mentioned, in polling right now where it isn't always good, and they're trying to figure out how to accurately reflect a changing world and changing. People don't use landlines anymore, for example. We actually don't cover, for the reasons he mentioned, don't do a lot of horse race journalism at Axios. We sometimes reference the polls and just giving people the context of whether a race is thought to be competitive or not, but we do not do a lot of stories on the polls for those exact reasons, and also because of some of the issues in polls. We try to build our stories around the issues and messages defining the race and that we think voters care about. I think this was a bit of an unusual election in terms of a few issues sucking up all the oxygen because of the timing of the Dobbs decision. One, that it was so fresh, and there were a lot of changes happening right after, with red states, and Minnesota's a state where abortion is protected, and so became very important to people here to kind of protect that as an island of abortion access, and as the states around us ban or restrict the procedure. Same with the democracy, right? Like the democracy being on the ballot, that was something that was very fresh with 2020. I think that the nationalization of all campaigns and messaging in all campaigns is an underlying problem. It is very hard as a reporter to cover other issues when you can't get the candidates to talk about the other issues. We see this where state legislative candidates are saying the same thing that U.S. Senate candidates in Georgia are saying or wherever on things, because there's this, political messaging machine that everybody's kind of playing by the same playbook. And so I think that's another reason you're hearing kind of an echo chamber on both sides. There was a memo that circulated this fall with David Ham, the chairman of the Republican Party, saying, telling all candidates, here's what to say if you're asked about abortion. And guess what? That's exactly what they all said. It's not on the ballot. That's exactly what they all said. So, you know, I think that's another factor. I would watch, you mentioned climate as being important to you or wanting to hear more about that. That's something we've actually heard about quite a bit in the last election, and I think we'll continue to, as it's an issue of a lot of importance to young voters, a lot of the polling suggests, and you talk to young voters and they talk about climate a lot. I do think that Democrats, House Democrats in particular, and Senate Democrats here, we're talking about climate and climate change, and that is one of their priorities for legislation. You did see, like, President Biden in the final stretch heading to the vote did take action on some other issues, including student loan forgiveness, right? That's now held up and blocked in the courts, but that was pretty momentous, and I think that was an indication or a signal of, you know, other issues beyond just those couple of issues that were bubbling up in the election, having resonance in the electorate. So, yeah, I don't know if it's as clear cut as there were only 3 issues in this election, but hopefully, as the last factor I guess I would throw out there is Axios is growing, but most newsrooms aren't getting bigger; they're getting smaller. And so there's fewer journalists covering just as much, if not more things. So I think that also, that's not an excuse, it's just an explanation. I think that also contributes to some of the lack of diversity in the coverage of issues and topics.
Okay, unfortunately, I have to call this session to an end so that we have time to go out and socialize a bit. But thank you so much to both of you for your very interesting and provocative presentations.
So, all right, can you get either one? Can either one of you stick around today? Afterwards, or, okay. If you can, okay, great. So, maybe if you have a last question, you could quickly get it in before they take off. Thanks again. So, let's socialize.